For 20 years, Gavin Bennett believed the same painful truth. He believed his mother chose another child over him. He believed she loved Wyatt more. He believed that every missed baseball game, every forgotten promise, and every moment his mother wasn't there was proof that he was never her priority. But standing beside his mother's coffin on a rainy afternoon in Portland, Oregon, Gavin was about to discover that everything he believed about his family was wrong. The funeral home was almost empty. The last guests had already said their goodbyes. The flowers surrounding Margaret Bennett's casket were beginning to lose their freshness, and the sound of rain hitting the windows filled the silence. Gavin stood quietly, staring at the woman who had raised him. A woman he loved. A woman he was still angry with. Because even after her death, one question remained unanswered. Why wasn't he enough? Why didn't she love him? For years, Gavin had carried those questions, and he had spent 20 years avoiding the person he believed had taken his place. Wyatt Bennett, his older brother, the boy who entered their family before Gavin was born, the boy who needed more attention, more patience, more understanding, the boy Gavin believed his mother chose. As Gavin picked up his coat and prepared to leave, a familiar voice stopped him. Gavin. He froze. He didn't need to turn around. He already knew who it was. Wyatt stood a few feet away. The last time they had spoken was almost 20 years earlier. Back then, they were brothers who shared the same house. Now, they were strangers who shared the same last name. Wyatt looked different. Older. In his hand was a small, worn envelope. I know you don't want to hear anything from me, Wyatt said. Gavin remained silent. Wyatt stepped closer. But Mom left this for you. Gavin looked at the envelope but didn't reach for it. No, I don't want it, he said with a sharp tone. Wyatt looked surprised. What do you mean, no? I mean I don't need it. Gavin answered. Gavin. Wyatt's voice cut through. I said no. Gavin yelled. His voice became sharper. I spent my entire childhood watching you get everything. Gavin continued. Wyatt lowered his eyes. You don't understand. Wyatt tried to explain. Gavin let out a quiet laugh. No, I understand perfectly. You were the one she worried about. You were the one she sacrificed for. You were the one she always had time for. Gavin said these words with pain. Wyatt stood there quietly. I don't need another excuse for why she chose you over me, Gavin said. The words hung in the air. For a moment, Wyatt said nothing. Then he looked at his younger brother and spoke softly. She never chose me. Gavin looked confused. What? Wyatt tightened his grip on the envelope. She never chose me over you. He paused. She was trying to keep me alive. Gavin stopped moving. Those words were not what he expected. For the first time in years, he didn't see Wyatt as the person who took something from him. He saw someone carrying his own pain. Wyatt held out the envelope. Everything you need to know is in here. Gavin stared at it. Because inside that envelope was a truth Margaret had taken to her grave. A truth that would change the way Gavin remembered his entire childhood. And before this story ends, you will understand why a mother can love two children deeply and still make one of the biggest mistakes of her life. Before we continue, if you enjoy emotional stories about family, forgiveness, and second chances, make sure you subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a story like this. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today? We would love to know how far this story reaches. Now, let's go back to where this family story truly began. Long before Gavin stood beside his mother's coffin with years of anger in his heart, there was a time when the Bennett family was simply trying to survive. Before Margaret became the woman Gavin blamed for leaving him behind, she was the person who helped put a broken family back together. And before Wyatt became the brother Gavin resented, he was just a young boy trying to understand why the person he loved most was never coming home. Wyatt Bennett was 8 years old when his world changed forever. His mother had been sick for a long time. At first, Wyatt didn't fully understand what was happening. Adults would lower their voices when they talked. His father, Thomas, would leave the room whenever doctors called. The house that once felt full of laughter slowly became filled with quiet conversations and worried faces. Wyatt only understood one thing. His mother was getting weaker. And one day, she was gone. After her death, Thomas became both a father and a caretaker overnight. He learned how to do things he had never done before. He learned how to pack school lunches. He learned how to help with homework. He learned how to comfort a child who woke up from nightmares asking for his mother. But no matter how much Thomas tried, he knew there was one thing he couldn't give Wyatt: a mother's presence. Wyatt didn't become angry overnight. He became quiet. He stopped asking questions because he could see the sadness in his father's eyes. He started acting like he was okay because he didn't want to make Thomas hurt more. And that was the beginning of something that would follow Wyatt for the rest of his life. He became the child who carried his pain silently. Years passed. Thomas focused on raising his son and building a stable life. He never wanted Wyatt to feel like he was missing anything. But deep down, he knew both of them were still carrying the loss of the woman they loved. Then Thomas met Margaret. Margaret Bennett was an elementary school teacher who had always believed that families were built through love, not just through blood. When Thomas introduced her to Wyatt, he didn't expect the relationship to be easy. Wyatt was old enough to remember his mother. He wasn't looking for someone to replace her. And Margaret understood that. She never walked into Wyatt's life pretending to be his new mother. She never said, "You need to accept me." She never tried to erase the memories he had. Instead, she simply told him the truth. "You already have a mother," Margaret said one evening when they were sitting together in the kitchen. Wyatt looked at her quietly. "I could never replace her." She paused. "But I hope one day you'll let me be another person who loves you." Those words stayed with Wyatt. Because for the first time, someone wasn't asking him to forget. Someone was simply asking him to allow more love into his life. But it wasn't immediate. Wyatt kept his distance at first, but there was still a wall between them. Margaret didn't force him to bring it down. She just kept showing up. She remembered the little things. She learned that Wyatt hated tomatoes in his sandwiches. She attended his school events. She stayed up late helping him study before exams. When he had a bad day, she didn't demand that he talk. She simply sat nearby and reminded him that he didn't have to face everything alone. Slowly, that wall began to disappear. Wyatt used to call Margaret by her name, but eventually, he started calling her Mom. For the first time since losing his mother, Wyatt felt like he had a family again. A few years later, Thomas and Margaret welcomed a baby boy into their lives. They named him Gavin. There was a 9-year age difference between the two brothers. Wyatt was already old enough to understand responsibility. Gavin was just a baby who looked up at his older brother with complete trust. And Wyatt loved him immediately. He would sit beside his crib and talk to him even before Gavin could understand a word. He would carry him around the house. He would make him laugh when he cried. As Gavin grew older, Wyatt became the person he admired most. To Gavin, Wyatt wasn't just his brother. He was his protector. The Bennett family finally felt complete. But life can change in a single moment. Wyatt Bennett turned 18. To everyone around him, he seemed like a normal teenager. He went to school. He had friends. He joked with his younger brother. He helped around the house. But losing his mother years earlier had left a wound he never truly talked about. And after becoming a teenager, that pain became harder for him to hide. Wyatt missed the woman who had given birth to him. Even though Margaret loved him like her own son, there were moments when Wyatt still wondered what his life would have looked like if his mother had never gotten sick. He also carried a quiet fear that he never shared with anyone. He was afraid of losing another person he loved. And unfortunately, that fear would soon become his reality. Around that time, Wyatt started spending time with a group of older teenagers who didn't always make the best choices. At first, it seemed harmless. They would hang out after school. They would drive around town. They would tell jokes and make plans for the future. But slowly, Wyatt started making decisions that were unlike him. He started staying out later. He stopped listening when Thomas and Margaret tried to talk to him. Thomas noticed the changes before anyone else. One evening, he sat down with Wyatt in the living room. "Son, I know you're trying to figure things out," Thomas said. "But you need to be careful about the people you surround yourself with." Wyatt looked away. "I'm fine, Dad." Thomas knew those words. Because parents often hear, "I'm fine," when their child is actually struggling. "I just don't want you to make a mistake that follows you for the rest of your life," Thomas told him. At the time, Wyatt didn't realize how much those words would mean later. Because just a few weeks after that conversation, one night changed everything. Margaret was sitting at home when the phone rang. It was late, later than Wyatt usually came home. The moment she saw the number, she felt something was wrong. The call was about Wyatt. He had gotten into trouble with the police after being with the wrong people. Thomas heard that. He grabbed his jacket and picked up his keys. "I'll go get him," he said. Margaret looked worried. "Thomas, it's raining heavily." He gave her a reassuring smile. "I'll be back soon." Those were the last words he ever said to her. Thomas drove through the rain toward the location where Wyatt was waiting. The roads were wet. Visibility was poor. And while Thomas was driving home with his son, Another driver ran a red light. The impact happened in seconds. A crash between both cars and an accident happened. Wyatt survived, but Thomas didn't. When Margaret received the news, she felt like the world had stopped. She had lost the person who held their family together. But for Wyatt, the pain was different. Because in his mind, there was one unavoidable truth. If he hadn't made that mistake, his father would still be alive. Everyone around him told him otherwise. The police explained that the other driver caused the accident. Margaret reminded him that Thomas loved him and would never blame him. But guilt doesn't always listen to logic. Wyatt replayed that night over and over. The phone call, his father's decision to come get him, the rain, the drive home, the crash. Every memory became another reason to blame himself. If I had just stayed home, if I had listened, if I hadn't caused trouble. Those thoughts followed him everywhere. And while everyone else saw a teenager who had lost his father, Wyatt saw someone responsible for taking him away. After the funeral, Wyatt changed. The boy who used to laugh with Gavin became quiet. He stopped making plans. He stopped talking about the future. He struggled to focus at school. He pushed people away. Margaret tried everything she could. She reminded him that Thomas loved him. She reminded him that one mistake did not define his entire life. But Wyatt couldn't forgive himself. Then one night, Margaret discovered something that terrified her. While cleaning Wyatt's room, she found a journal hidden away among his belongings. A journal that showed just how much pain he had been carrying alone and constant thoughts he had of harming himself. For the first time, Margaret realized Wyatt wasn't simply grieving. He was losing hope. This was a boy she saw as her own son, even if she didn't give birth to him. And from that moment forward, she made a decision. She would do whatever it took to bring her son back. But she didn't realize that while she was fighting to save Wyatt, another child in the same house was quietly learning what it felt like to be forgotten. After Thomas' death, the house felt different. Margaret was trying to survive losing her husband. Wyatt was trying to survive the guilt he carried. And Gavin, only 9 years old, was trying to understand why the family he knew suddenly felt so different. But unlike the others, Gavin didn't have the words to explain what he was feeling. He didn't understand grief the way adults did. He only understood what he saw. And what he saw was his mother spending almost every moment trying to help Wyatt. After Thomas died, Wyatt became Margaret's biggest concern. She noticed when he stopped eating. She noticed when he stayed in his room for hours. She noticed when he stopped talking about the future. And every time she looked at him, she saw the same frightened child she had met years earlier. The little boy who had already lost his mother. Now he had lost his father too. Margaret couldn't lose him as well. She found a counselor for Wyatt. She rearranged her schedule. She stayed awake late at night when Wyatt couldn't sleep. Sometimes she would sit outside his bedroom door for hours because she was afraid he was hurting more than he admitted. She wasn't trying to choose Wyatt over Gavin. She was trying to keep a broken teenager from completely giving up. But Gavin didn't know that. All Gavin knew was that his mother was no longer the same. One weekend, Gavin had a baseball game. It was one of the biggest games of the season. He had spent weeks practicing because he wanted his mother to see him play. Before leaving, Margaret promised him she would be there. "I wouldn't miss it," she told him. Gavin believed her. He kept looking toward the stands during the game, waiting, watching, hoping to see her walk in. But she never arrived. After the game, Gavin found out why. Wyatt had a difficult night. Margaret had stayed home because she was worried about him. When Gavin walked through the door, he didn't complain. He didn't yell. He simply said, "It's okay." But it wasn't okay. That was the beginning of a pattern. And sometimes, the quietest pain is the easiest to miss. A few weeks later, Margaret promised to attend another event. She missed that one too. Then another. Each time, she had a reason. Each reason made sense. But to a child, repeated disappointment starts to feel personal. Gavin began asking himself questions he was too young to answer. Why does he always need her more than me? Why does she always choose him? Would she notice if I needed her too? The painful part was that Margaret did notice Gavin. She loved him deeply, but she made the mistake many parents make. She assumed the child who was doing well didn't need as much attention. Gavin was responsible. He was calm. He didn't get into trouble. He didn't cry for help. So Margaret believed he was okay. But Gavin wasn't okay. He was learning how to hide his feelings. He was learning how to become the child nobody worried about. Years passed, and the distance between Gavin and Margaret slowly grew. Not because they stopped loving each other, but because neither of them knew how to talk about the hurt that had built between them. Wyatt eventually began to heal. With time, counseling, and Margaret's support, he started rebuilding his life. He graduated. He found his purpose. He became the kind of man Thomas would have been proud of. But by then, something between the brothers had changed. The little boy who once looked at Wyatt like a hero now saw him as the reason he had lost his mother's attention. Wyatt never realized it. He never knew Gavin felt abandoned, because Gavin never said anything. And Margaret never realized how deeply those missed moments had affected him. By the time Gavin became an adult, the distance was already there. He loved his family, but he no longer felt like he belonged in it. Eventually, he made a decision. He left Portland. He left the house filled with memories. And he left behind the people he believed had already chosen each other. For the next 20 years, Gavin and Wyatt barely spoke. Two brothers, two different wounds, both believing they had been hurt by the other, and neither knowing the full truth. When Gavin Bennett left Portland, he told himself he was leaving because he needed a fresh start. But deep down, he was also running from a feeling he had carried since childhood. The feeling that he was never the one people worried about, never the one people fought for, never the one someone would choose first. He didn't hate his family. That would have been easier. The truth was, Gavin still loved them. He loved his mother. He loved his brother. But love became complicated when it was mixed with years of disappointment. So he created distance. At first, he thought the distance would make things easier. He thought time would heal everything. But sometimes, time doesn't heal wounds. Sometimes, it only teaches people how to live with them. Gavin moved away and began building a life of his own. He carried one thing with him that always reminded him of his father: a love for working with his hands. Thomas had taught him woodworking when he was young. Before the accident, Gavin remembered sitting beside his father in the garage, watching him turn ordinary pieces of wood into something meaningful. Thomas would always tell him, "Good work takes patience. You can't rush something that is meant to last." Those words stayed with Gavin. Years later, he opened a small woodworking business. It wasn't a huge company. It wasn't the kind of business that made him rich, but it was his. Every table, every cabinet, every piece of furniture carried a little piece of the lessons his father had given him. For a while, things went well. Customers appreciated his work. People respected the attention he put into every detail. And for the first time in years, Gavin felt like he had built something without needing anyone's approval. He was proud of himself. But life doesn't always stay the same. Over time, competition increased. Large companies began offering cheaper products. Orders became less frequent. The bills continued coming. And slowly, the business Gavin had worked so hard to build started struggling. He worked longer hours. He took fewer days off. He stopped spending money on himself. But he refused to ask for help. Not because he didn't need it, but because asking for help felt too much like admitting he couldn't handle things. And Gavin had spent his entire life proving he could handle things. Meanwhile, back in Portland, Wyatt Bennett had built a life of his own. The teenager who once believed he was responsible for his father's death had grown into a successful man. After years of struggling with guilt, Wyatt eventually learned to forgive himself. He built a career in construction. He worked hard. He became respected in his field. But there was one thing that never changed. He never stopped thinking about Gavin. For years, Wyatt wondered if his younger brother hated him. He wondered if Gavin remembered the good times they had before everything changed. He wondered if there was any way to fix something that had been broken for so long. But every time he considered reaching out, fear stopped him. He was afraid Gavin would reject him. So instead, Wyatt found another way to help quietly, without asking for recognition, without expecting forgiveness. Through his construction connections, Wyatt began sending work toward Gavin's woodworking business. Large furniture orders, custom projects, opportunities that helped keep Gavin's company alive. But Gavin never knew. Every time a new order arrived, he assumed it was because his business was finally getting another chance. He never imagined that the brother he blamed for taking his mother's love away was the same person quietly helping him survive. Wyatt didn't do it because he wanted Gavin to forgive him. He didn't do it because he wanted credit. He did it because Margaret had taught him something years earlier. Family isn't only about who shares your name. It's about who shows up when life becomes difficult. And Wyatt knew Gavin needed someone, even if Gavin didn't know it was him. Then one day, Margaret received devastating news. She was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. The illness progressed quickly, and for the first time in years, Wyatt and Gavin were facing the same loss. The woman who had spent her entire life trying to protect them was running out of time. Margaret knew she didn't have much time left. But there was one thing she couldn't leave behind. A misunderstanding between two brothers. She knew Gavin still carried pain. She knew Wyatt still carried guilt. And before she passed away, she wrote 2 letters. One for Wyatt. One for Gavin. Words she had held inside for years. Words she hoped would finally help them understand what she had never been able to explain. When Margaret died, Gavin returned to Portland for the funeral. But he wasn't returning as the little boy who wanted his mother's attention. He was returning as a man who still had unanswered questions. And standing inside that funeral home, facing Wyatt after 20 years of silence, he was about to finally learn the truth. The truth about why Margaret made the choices she made. And the truth about the brother he thought had taken everything from him. The funeral was over. The people who came to say goodbye to Margaret Bennett had already left the building. But for Gavin, the hardest part was not watching his mother being buried. It was standing there with all the feelings he had never been able to resolve. For 20 years, Gavin had carried the same pain. Death does not erase unanswered questions. Sometimes, it makes them heavier. As Gavin stood near the entrance of the funeral home, Wyatt walked toward him with the envelope Margaret had left behind. At first, Gavin didn't want it. He didn't want another explanation. He didn't want another reason why things happened the way they did. But something inside him made him take it. Maybe because, after 20 years, he finally wanted the truth. Or maybe because a part of him was still the little boy waiting for his mother to explain why she wasn't there. He opened the letter carefully. The first few words in the letter immediately caught his attention. My dear Gavin, if you are reading this, then I am no longer there to explain these things myself. There is something I need you to know. You were never the child I loved less. Gavin stopped. His eyes moved over the words again. Because those were the words he had spent his entire life needing to hear. He continued reading. I know there were moments when you felt like I chose Wyatt over you. I know there were birthdays, games, and important moments when you looked for me and I wasn't there. I know those moments hurt you. And I am sorry. Gavin's hands tightened around the paper. For the first time, he wasn't hearing an excuse. He was hearing his mother's apology. Margaret continued. You believed I loved Wyatt more. But the truth is, I was afraid I would lose him. After your father died, Wyatt carried a pain that was too heavy for someone so young. He blamed himself for something that was never his fault. He believed he didn't deserve to be happy. And I was terrified that if I stopped fighting for him, he would give up completely. Gavin looked up from the letter. For years, he had only seen one side of the story. He saw Wyatt receiving attention. He never saw the reason why. He never saw the nights Wyatt cried alone. The guilt he carried. The pain he hid. Margaret's words continued. I spent so much time trying to save Wyatt that I failed to see the pain you were carrying quietly. And that is the part one regret the most. Gavin's eyes filled with tears. Because those words were exactly what he had felt. Not that his mother didn't love him, but that she didn't notice him. Margaret wrote, I never worried about your heart because I knew how strong it was. Looking back, that was my greatest mistake. Strong children still need to be held. They still need to be seen, and their feelings matters too. Wyatt watched silently. Finally, Gavin spoke. Why didn't you tell me? Wyatt looked down. Because I thought you already hated me. Gavin shook his head. I didn't hate you. He paused. I hated what I thought you took from me. Wyatt nodded slowly. I know. For a moment, neither brother spoke. Then Wyatt finally said the words he had carried for years. I never wanted her attention because I was more important. He looked at Gavin. I needed her because I was broken. Those words changed something. Because for the first time, Gavin didn't see Wyatt as the person who stole something from him. He saw him as another person who had been suffering. A child who lost his father. A teenager who blamed himself. A man who spent years trying to make things right. But Wyatt still had one more thing to show him. Something Gavin never expected. He reached into his bag and pulled out a folder. I need you to see this. Gavin opened it. Inside were documents. Invoices. Contracts. Payment records. At first, Gavin didn't understand what he was looking at. Then he recognized the name of his woodworking company. His eyes moved across the pages. These were the biggest orders his business had received over the past several years. The orders that kept him from closing. The projects that allowed him to keep paying his bills. He looked at Wyatt. What is this? Gavin asked. Wyatt took a deep breath. When your business started struggling, I found out. Wyatt answered. Gavin stared at him. You knew? Gavin asked. Wyatt nodded. I didn't know how to come back into your life. I didn't know if you would even want me there. He looked at the papers. So I helped the only way I knew how. Gavin looked through the documents again. All those years. All those times he thought he was surviving alone. Someone had been quietly standing behind him. His brother. The same brother he blamed for everything. Why? Gavin asked. Wyatt looked at him. Because you're my little brother. And for the first time in 20 years. Gavin didn't have an answer. Because the person he spent years blaming was the person who never stopped caring. For a long moment, Gavin stood there holding the folder in his hands. The funeral home was quiet. The same place where he had walked in carrying 20 years of anger was now the place where everything he believed was beginning to change. Both brothers had been misunderstood, and neither of them had known the full story. Gavin looked down at the letter again. His mother's handwriting blurred as tears filled his eyes. His mother loved him. She had just failed to see that he needed her in a different way. She saw Wyatt's wounds because they were visible. She missed Gavin's wounds because he hid them, and that realization hurt. But the truth was that neither of them were responsible for the pain they carried. They were just two children who experienced loss differently. Then Gavin did something neither of them expected. He stepped forward, and he hugged his big brother. Wyatt held on tightly, because for years, he wondered if he would ever have his little brother back. And finally, he did. Outside, the rain continued falling over Portland. But inside that funeral home, something that had been broken for decades finally started to heal. Months later, Gavin returned to his woodworking shop. But things felt different. The business was still challenging. Life was still complicated. But he was no longer carrying everything alone. Wyatt became part of his life again. As his brother, the two men began rebuilding their relationship slowly. They talked about their father. They talked about Margaret. They talked about the years they lost. They didn't pretend those years never happened. They faced them. Because healing doesn't come from ignoring the past. It comes from finally understanding it. One evening, while the brothers sat inside Gavin's workshop, surrounded by pieces of unfinished furniture, Gavin looked at Wyatt and said, "Do you ever think about what Mom would say if she saw us now?" Wyatt smiled. "I think she'd tell us we took long enough." For the first time in years, they laughed together. A real laugh. The kind they used to share when they were younger. And in that moment, they both understood something Margaret had spent her life trying to teach them. Family is not about never hurting each other. Family is about choosing to understand each other when the truth finally comes out. And even in those moments of hurt. Because every family has moments they wish they could change. Every parent makes mistakes. Every child carries things they never say out loud. And sometimes the people who appear strongest are the ones who need the most care. Being strong does not mean someone doesn't need love. It doesn't mean they don't need reassurance. It doesn't mean they don't want someone to notice when they are struggling. Sometimes the quiet child needs someone to ask, "Are you really okay?" Sometimes the person who carries everyone else needs someone to carry them too. Years after Margaret's death, Gavin kept her letters safely stored away. Not because it erased the pain, but because it reminded him of something important. People are more complicated than the moments when they hurt us. A mother can make mistakes and still love deeply. A brother can cause pain and still care deeply. And a family can break apart and still find its way back together. So before you leave this story, think about the people in your own life. The ones who always say they are fine. The ones who never ask for help. The ones everyone depends on because they seem strong. Maybe they need someone to remind them that they don't have to carry everything alone.